morning, and thank you very much for joining us for this session. As Jamil said, this is such an important part of the broader conversation, particularly for conservatives that want to be relevant in current, future elections. And so much of that is the increasing demographics, diversity in urban centers. How can you win? How do you inject yourself into the conversation? I'm fortunate to be joined by two of the arguably the most leading thinkers when it comes to things on urban policy. Rayhan and Aaron have written more about this issue than I will ever know about, so we're very fortunate to have both of you here. I'm just going to sort of begin by saying there are so many things changing, Rayhan, when it comes to demographics, when it comes to diversity, when it comes to priorities about where tax dollars and resources are spent in a municipality. Innovation is changing things, technology is changing things. So let's just start talking more broadly about that very question. Future of cities, it's a big one, but parsing it down to how you see a conversation where conservative philosophies can inject themselves into that future.
Well, when you're looking at the US case in particular, you have a lot of really profound challenges. So one thing to keep in mind is that, something like 85% of the US is urbanized in the loosest, broadest sense. If you're looking at the 10 largest metro areas, they represent a kind of about 40% of the overall population. This is, quite significant. So those areas, however, are governed in a range of different ways. Across the U.S., different states have very different approaches, very different local fiscal incentives and what have you. So you're going to get big differences, for example, New York City and New York State versus Los Angeles and California, et cetera, et cetera. And then when you're looking at metropolitan America, in many cases, a large majority of the residents of a given metropolitan area are going to be outside of the urban core. They're going to be in areas that are small incorporated communities or even unincorporated communities. And the way that governance works is going to really range very, very widely. One of the big issues when you're looking at the kind of biggest central cities in the US right now is that it really is true, as Adrian was referencing, that you're facing some pretty serious kind of technological headwinds. So one could argue that the last 30 years or so represented a kind of urban renaissance. When you're looking at educated, skilled professionals, center city living was becoming somewhat more attractive in at least some of these places, particularly the most prominent major American cities. And that was something that was somewhat beneficial. You had big talent agglomerations in some of these cities, New York City, the Bay Area, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Boston, the so-called superstar cities in the U.S. But now you have a couple of things that are changing. One is that 30-year urban renaissance was driven in no small part by a dramatic improvement in public safety, pretty significant reductions in violent crime. That was one thing that made city living more attractive, more tractable. Another element is that basically people have been predicting for many, many decades that remote work, that the advent of the internet is going to kind of weaken the power of agglomeration, and it didn't quite happen. Now, however, we're in a period where, at least to some extent, you don't necessarily need to be in the kind of heart of the downtown if you want to work in elite financial services and technology and what have you. One could argue that it still benefits you, particularly earlier in your career. It could still benefit you as you're in the phase of kind of learning and kind of building that intellectual capital. But it doesn't seem to be quite as essential as it had been before. And what that means is that you have a new era of intensified competition for location. And now that competition to some degree is happening among cities. So it's not, city to rural necessarily. It is San Francisco sees people moving to Austin. People from LA go to Dallas. People from New York go to Miami. There are these kind of city pairs. You see the rise of a place like Nashville, for example. Cities that had been peripheral secondary cities now find that the difference, the gap in terms of amenities is somewhat smaller than it had been before. for a variety of different reasons. So that is something that, again, represents a big opportunity for some cities and a big challenge for other cities. And one assumes that when you're looking at various technological developments, could that be a self-reinforcing cycle? Cities, legacy cities that had taken their attractiveness for granted. Are we in a world now where, because of the governance challenges that we can get into later, they don't recognize that they're in a more intensified competitive landscape, and they fail to basically successfully compete. And then you see this kind of big change in the kind of hierarchy of kind of which cities are most attractive to young, productive people.
Aaron, you have written extensively about many of the jurisdictions of the United States that have seen some of this renaissance, some of this change, for example. So a lot of what happens in the United States, it does ultimately make its way up north here in Canada. So the experiences are very similar. There's housing shortages, there's infrastructure problems, there's high taxes that people don't feel are going to the resources and the benefits that they're not fixing the pavements and the pipes, and people at the core of it don't necessarily feel safe in their communities. And you can look at the statistics one way or another. I'm wondering if you can talk about some of those basic core policies that you have looked at and studied, and talk about some of that.
Yeah. Ronald Reagan had this famous quip that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And
Still true today.
That's a sense in which that's true at the national level. When you interact with departments like the tax authorities. When we start getting down to the city municipal level, it's not true. People are generally very happy when the fire department shows up, when their house is burning, happy when the police show up when you call them. They like parks, they like libraries, they like well-maintained streets. And conservatives once understood this when it came to cities. And if you roll the clock back to the 1990s, in the United States, really it was conservative mayors who were really seen as the innovative, dynamic, competent leaders of cities. People like Rudy Giuliani in New York or Steve Goldsmith in Indianapolis, where I live today, were really seen as urban innovators. And it's really hard to relate to New York City pre-Giuliani. There were over 2,000 murders a year in New York City. And even more than that, perhaps, was this sense that the city was simply ungovernable. I believe it was Nathan Glazer who coined the term the ungovernable city. It's too big, it's too complex, the problems are too intractable, too many special interests, we just can't do anything about it. Well, Giuliani comes in and shows that you can do something about it. And crime collapsed, not just murders, but also property crimes. I mean, car theft, he shut down all the chop shops. He got rid of all the squeegee guys that used to harass you on the street. He cleaned up Times Square. And this really dramatically transformed the city for the better, to the point where when his successor, Michael Bloomberg, wanted to run for mayor, he chose to run as a Republican, even though he wasn't really a Republican. Now, he had multiple reasons for doing that, but the key is the Republican brand was actually pretty good in some cities, even if it was still kind of Democratic dominated, because they had ideas and they were delivering on what people thought couldn't be delivered on. Well, now that we've had this urban renaissance, 30 years of a boom, I think, led urban leaders to get complacent. And they really thought the power of agglomerations, the desire of tech workers to live downtown, the global city hype was so true that nothing could ever derail these cities, and they were essentially invincible. And therefore, it set the stage for what I call the return of ideology. Especially around depolicing being one of the principal vectors of that. And even pre-pandemic, this sort of lack of focus on delivering the basics and quality of governance was causing problems in housing costs, in transport. But really with this pandemic, we saw a tremendous rise in crime, tremendous rise in public disorder and problems like homelessness, as well as what Raihan, which I totally agree with what he said, remote work has really called into question the future of the central business districts of some of these places. And now, again, the problems are not like the 70s and the 80s, but there are serious problems that are concerning the citizens again. In the city of Portland, Oregon, historically just one of the safest cities in America, between 2000 and 2019, averaged 23 murders a year. And one or plus or minus 2 or 3, basically. In 2022, we had 97 murders. So the murder rate quadrupled in 3 years. And while it's still probably on the safer side of Sizzy, that you notice that. And as you say, things are making their way here. I read articles about crime on the Toronto subways. You can see homelessness here in Ottawa. So these problems are here. The ideologies have made their way north as well. And so I think these growing problems create opportunity that may not have been there before for conservatives to engage politically and in the policy front. And I think, like in the 90s, it really is going to require a couple of things. One, it's going to require what I call positive governing agenda. It can't just be about austerity or reducing government. I mean, Giuliani got rid of reduced the welfare rolls by 1 million people. Okay, so he knew how to cut government, but it was also about better government because, again, these core goods and services, people depend on them, and so having a positive governing agenda is important. You also have to be competent. Homelessness is a hard problem. Getting our transport costs under control is a hard problem. But if conservatives are able to deliver on it, that's one thing. So I think the positive governing agenda and competence are two things. And then obviously it needs to be someone who has a social sensibility that's going to play in the city. So it's probably going to be someone who's more pro-urban, who's not necessarily as populist, who's maybe more pro-immigration, those sorts of things.
I think that's such an important part of the conversation, Raihan, because there is this sort of classic urban-rural, shall we say, split, where the rural tends to be predominantly, small C conservative voters that will vote on that side of the aisle, whereas then they look at the so-called urban elites as the ones, voting Liberal or NDP, for example, or in your case, Democrat. But those sort of political lines are blurring. And I think you touched on it a bit because there's not enough space for everybody just to live in downtown core. It's all spreading out. The value of having some of those principles and values from a conservative perspective that aren't just all about the cold market solution, which is often what conservatives come up with. They look thoughtless, they don't look caring, and then the so-called left always ends up winning anyway. So I'm wondering from your viewpoint about that urban-rural divide, the myth, the fact of it, the increased immigration is changing a lot of that. I would like you to weigh in on that.
One of the big challenges for conservatives operating at the local and state level in the United States is the intense nationalization of American politics. And I believe you see this pattern obtained in other market democracies as well. And what I mean by nationalization is that partly because of a changing media landscape, for a variety of different reasons, a mix of things that are both technological and social, we live in a world now where you don't necessarily identify as intensely with your neighborhood or with your city as you do with people, nationally or even globally who share certain sensibilities with you, right? And that winds up being translated into our politics so that there's a perception, as you were suggesting, Adrian, that if you are someone who is, educated, affluent person who thinks of yourself as broadly cosmopolitan, you consume certain kinds of media, whether you're in a so-called red state or blue state, you're typically going to vote for Democrats, and that effect has, kind of become more intense. And with the Republican side, it's almost there's this perception that you're not looking at issues, that are specific to what's happening at the state and local level. If you're an ambitious politician in one of the big U.S. cities, you're not necessarily your messaging. If you're trying to win a primary election, you're not necessarily talking about picking up trash. You're not necessarily talking about the actual basics of kind of competent good government that Aaron was referencing before. You might engage in kind of ideological grandstanding about issues that you have no authority over. It's kind of like the way that when you're looking at, a big public university in the U.S., the student government will issue some denunciation of something happening in the Middle East, right? I mean, something that you have no control over. But that's the way that you distinguish yourself. That's the way you play into these kind of nationalized political themes. So what you see happen is that national partisanship is mirrored almost perfectly when you're looking at low salience elections at the state and local level. Basically when you're going to the voting booth, you're voting for city council, you don't necessarily know Who is this person? Who is that person? You have a few basic heuristics at your disposal. In the US, we'll oftentimes have partisan elections at the local level. So, okay, I'll vote for the person who represents the party that I vote for at the federal level, even though the issues are drastically different. And even in nonpartisan elections, what you'll see happen is that people will vote for people on the basis of ethnicity. Let's say, oh, I see someone with a Chinese surname. I see someone with a, Latin surname. So I will vote on that basis. I think it's quite destructive. One thing that you'll see happen is that you'll see some reformers push for nonpartisan elections. But again, in nonpartisan elections, you don't have some other reliable heuristic you can use. In a perfect world, you could say we would have different political parties at the state and local level. However, our parties, our party brands, are so powerful, so entrenched, that it's actually kind of very difficult for that to happen. You can't ban the Republican or Democratic Party from operating at that level. So then the challenge is, how do you break out of that pattern? If you're someone in a monolithically left-of-center place, how do you kind of change it? I think Aaron referenced that before. He was touching on that before. You have a different synthesis. If you look at someone like Ken Sim in Vancouver, he's someone who is emphasizing issues that are going to resonate with a small C conservative voter, these kind of law and order concerns, but he's also just really not engaging explicitly in federal politics. And he's signaling in some ways that I imagine conservative voters might find annoying, that he's not one of those people, he's not one of those conservatives. But when you're operating at the local level in these monolithically left of center places, you bite your tongue and you make compromises sometimes. You have to build different kinds of coalitions. And you see that in the US where you have basically folks who have a conservative disposition backing people who are moderate Democrats in some cases, because that's going to be your best option. And actually you have some people who position themselves as moderate Democrats who, in a different national political environment, might be people who would explicitly identify with the right, but for a variety of reasons, including cultural associations, it's just not tractable for them to do that. And I think that that is a big challenge. How do you address that perceived cultural liability? One other thing I'll mention on the political front is that one dynamic we have that's different from a kind of parliamentary system is that in statewide races, when you're looking at these urban cores that are, majority Democratic, losing by 20 points is much better than losing by 50 points, right? Because if you're talking about a Senate race, you're talking about a gubernatorial race, that can really make a big difference. And so actually the kind of margins matter, and that's one reason why, certainly in the US context, I would argue that you want to actually build the party, you want to build the brand of these places, even when you don't expect to win, or you don't expect to win in the short term, because, again, those margins matter. What you're seeing in much of the US now, what you saw between 2016 and 2022, is that you have a bunch of areas, urban core areas, working class areas, heavily Hispanic and Asian in some cases, where you actually saw a pronounced shift to the right. Mm-hmm. That pronounced shift to the right was not enough to deliver victory, but it was enough to actually make quite a difference. There's also a way in which some of these concerns about public safety, about violent crime, that's a fascinating conversation unto itself, but where that can actually affect electoral outcomes on the periphery of the metro area, in suburban and exurban regions. So that's something to also be mindful of. You can shrink the margins, the urban cores, but you can also have quite a big effect in the kind of urban periphery as well.
Aaron, I'm interested from your perspective, someone who has looked at different jurisdictions, looked at the demographics, looked at the changes, certainly because there are, save for a few jurisdictions, there's no partisan, there's no party at the municipal level. So you do have to build different coalitions in order to get your agenda through. But in your experience, what cities are getting it right? And what exactly is that?
Yes, I'll just say first, I'm a believer that monopolies generally deliver bad service. They're not responsive to their customers. They tend to be very expensive. They tend to be very inefficient. And the same is true of political monopolies. And so that's why I believe it's in our best interest to have political competition. Even a monolithically conservative, municipality or provincial government that has no pushback, that has no real opposition with a chance to lead, that does not produce good governance. Where I live in Indianapolis, Indiana, the state government is supermajority Republican. and they do a lot of dumb things, let's be honest, because they can get away with it. So political competition is in everyone's best interest. I do think there are areas in the United States that have had what I call conservative governance that have done some really very interesting things from a policy perspective. One of the best is Oklahoma City. Now, Oklahoma City, it's a metro area of between 1 and 2 million people. It's a fairly large municipality, and it has nonpartisan elections, but has basically been Republican controlled for quite some time. In the very early 90s, there was a huge economic development competition. It was the Amazon HQ2 of its day for United Airlines was going to build a gigantic new maintenance base in some city. And Oklahoma City came in second. So they were a finalist and they lost. And they asked United, well, give us the loss review. Tell us why you lost. They said, well, let me tell you what happened. We flew some of our people here from our San Francisco maintenance base to have them take a look around, some of our employees, and they all reported back that they could never imagine moving here or their families living here. And they really took that to heart. And they're like, we have to improve the city to make it a place people want to live, not just a place that prospers because of an occasional gas boom. And so they created this program which they called MAPS, Metropolitan Area Projects. And what it was basically a series of capital improvement programs in which there was a temporary sunset 1 percentage point increase in the local sales tax that was used to fund parks improvements, downtown improvements, convention centers, bringing an NBA team to town, renovating the schools, adding sidewalks. Basically, the city didn't really have sidewalks. All of those basic things. And I think what distinguished this and really illustrates, the conservative nature of this plan. One, you do see that it's about spending money in a city, which is something that the austerity-driven, national and state conservatives might not have gone for. But one, it was a temporary tax that had to be approved by the voters. It was ring-fenced for a specific name list of capital project. It was all funded on a pay-as-you-go basis, so there was no borrowing, so no risk that they're going to borrow money and not be able to pay it back. And so, and then there was an outside citizens oversight board that basically was monitoring what was happening to see you go. And it was really well. All these projects were done well. They were very successful. 8 or 10 years later, the sales tax expired. And it's like, okay, if you want to keep spending this money, you have to go back and reauthorize it to the voters. So they're on their 4th iteration of this. And every single time, they have to go back and re-justify why they're going to spend this money because the voters have to approve reauthorizing the tax. So it's been essentially debt-free public works investments, dramatically improved quality of life. And now Oklahoma City is not quite Texas, but it's a very booming city. And you can see the transformation with many things that they've done there. So that's an example of one where I think interjecting some conservative principles around pay-as-you-go, ring-fenced money, competent delivery, voter authorization, citizen oversight board, all those things were very good. What I do see is, I think the conundrum for conservatives in cities is when they succeed, again, they set the conditions for their own liquidation, which is, when the companies are telling you, we're not going to invest in your city because it's terrible, then you take action. When there's big crime problems, you take action. But once everything starts going well, again, it's this return of ideology. And so one thing I would say is that one of the things Giuliani did not do is he didn't build political infrastructure in the cities. And you often see that somebody gets elected as this mayor, there actually has to be the development, along with some of these policies and politics, conservatives have to develop political infrastructure in the city that makes them sustainable for the long term and find a way to continue refreshing their toolkit so that people continue to find them relevant after they succeed. And so what we see in Oklahoma City, it's also been drifting in a more left direction. The latest MAPS program is a little more social justice-y. Again, because the existential threat of companies aren't investing here, nobody wants to move here, is now relieved. The ideology is creeping in. So they have probably stayed too much with the same program and didn't come up with new things. So I say you constantly need to be refreshing your toolkit, and you need to also be developing political infrastructure in the city so that when you actually succeed, you are creating sustainable success politically and for the long term of the city. Because, again, in some of these cities, the fact that conservatives kind of disappeared set the stage for these crime rates, these other issues, which have a tremendously negative effect on the city and its citizens.
And then we end up all reacting to it, Raihan. That's part of the challenge. At the municipal level, it's the closest level of government to the people. You physically see your garbage being taken away. You get on the transit system, if it's working that day or not. You see your sidewalk being shoveled, your snow roads being plowed. It is the one layer of government that you can physically touch and see every day, not like perhaps other levels. Yet it's arguably the area where people are most disengaged, depending on the situation. If there's an issue in their community, they'll get involved. They'll go to a town hall. They'll speak to their counselor, whatever the case may be. But for the most part, the citizenry itself is just disengaged. Municipal infrastructure projects go over budget and over time far too often. Aaron's discussion about Oklahoma City, I think, is so important in terms of having those pay-as-you-go type of things. But that's not even a notion that's ever entertained in frankly, any city in Canada, to my knowledge, in spite of, some organizations pushing for something like that. So I only bring that up in the broader sense that often what happens is you'll have someone governing for 4 years, 8 years, 12 years. That tends to be a big spender. And then someone on the other side of the aisle comes in and then cut, because we can't afford this anymore. Then they get thrown out of office because they look dispassionate. They don't look like they are investing in people. That's a truism, I think, for any level of government, be it municipal, federal, or provincial. How do Conservatives grapple with that? Is there a sweet spot, as it were, where they can take some of those policies and continue on them in order to benefit all of the citizenry and still maintain, either maintain themselves, retain office, or can create that legacy moving forward?
I suspect that the next 20, 30 years are going to be extremely challenging and uncomfortable for small government conservatives, simply because of demographic change. I mean, this is going to be obvious to all of you, but basically you have a challenge of very serious demographic stagnation and rapid aging. The United States and Canada have taken very different approaches to inward migration. It's much higher in Canada than the United States, yet despite that, you have very low fertility and rapid aging, kind of even in the face of these inward flows. And what that means is that mechanically, when you say that the public sector is going to be the backstop for medical care, whether for the entire population or for the elderly, when you're looking at the challenge of long-term care, these are things that, whether we like it or not, we decided decades ago are going to be things that are going to be residing in the public sector. Then you have some kind of further challenges. For example, if you're looking at the kind of quality of life issues that Aaron is talking about so thoughtfully, if you look at the United States, certainly, public employment at the federal level is dwarfed by public employment at the state and local level. That's actually where it happens. And if you compare today to 10 years ago, pre-kind of Great Recession, actually state and local employment is still kind of slightly lower than it had been, back then. So actually you see a lot of domains where there is an appetite for further increases in public employment. You certainly see that in law enforcement. There is an argument that I certainly believe very strongly that the United States is under-policed. Now again, this is a kind of big ideological debate, but compared to a lot of other market democracies, we just don't have that many police per capita despite very high levels of violent crime. But the thing is that, okay, actually public employment is can be ruinously expensive, or you can have civil service protections that make it very difficult to remove people who are not especially competent, and then you have collective bargaining. That's uneven, that varies from place to place, but these are very, very big challenges. So in a way, if you're someone who cares about administrative capacity, you care about a government that can be effective, you can't just say, well, let's just kind of roll back public employment completely. Let's just kind of wipe it out. Let's kind of shrink government drastically at the state and local level. You actually have to get into that very uncomfortable position of saying, how can we actually make this work? How can we make it more responsive? How can we bring in some private sector principles, but in a way that is actually not going to be destructive of the kind of public service ethic. This is very, very hard stuff, and I kind of wish we didn't have to deal with it, because the beauty of the private sector is that entities can go out of business, right? I mean, if they're not working, if they're not kind of meeting the needs of their customers, they can go out of business. So that is a really profound challenge, and I think it's something that people kind of prefer not to think about. But I think that it is unavoidable. Just to kind of get you thinking a bit about the future, something that I don't necessarily think is going to happen. I'm an optimist about technology as a general rule. I think that automation is going to be a very good thing. It'll enhance productivity. It'll be very, very good across the board. However, we could be looking at some technologies right now that are not going to be a challenge for less skilled workers, right, which is the pattern that we've seen in the recent past. We could be seeing the advent of technologies that are going to represent a challenge for skilled workers, for people who kind of think of themselves as kind of white-collar professionals who are entitled to a kind of middle-class, even upper-middle-class standard of living. We could be living in a world where actually some of those people are the ones who are facing the most intense economic headwinds, the kind of intense pressures. People who are in their 40s and 50s and older, who still need to be working, but who find that their kind of market value is lower than it had been. So in a way, that could be a great boon for the public sector, because think about public school teachers, for example. It could be that the talent pool that they have access to is kind of much, much better than it had been before. But again, that is a totally dysfunctional sector. Certainly in the U.S., it's kind of heavily unionized, and where there's almost an antagonism between the interests of teachers and students. So in a way, some of these technologies, some of these challenges could create opportunities for better governance. But you actually have to be thinking about that actively and creatively to get the best out of that. And I think that for those of us on the right, we need to start thinking about these issues now.
We're going to have a few questions from the audience, and there are some young folks from Conservative Values Tomorrow that are going to pose a question. The first question is going to come from Jonah Davids. I don't know where Jonah is. Is he somewhere? There he is. Come up, young Jonah. Ask a question.
All right. Hi, guys. So my question is about the relationship between cities and youth mental health. So right now, as you guys probably know, people are talking about a youth mental health crisis. Especially among Gen Z, we see really high rates of depression, anxiety, and other issues. It also seems like a lot of young people are having trouble just getting their life started, becoming an independent person. We see them, dating less, having sex less, living at home more. I think they have very, very low rates compared to previous generations of even getting driver's licenses. So we see people just having a hard time kind of getting started in life. My question is, do you guys think there are changes at the local municipal level? It could be changes about services or even just to housing policy or the structure of cities, urban design, that could potentially create communities in which young people are able to be less depressed, be less anxious, and be more independent.
Aaron, I'm going to go to you on that one first. And one thing that Jonah didn't mention, I think the pandemic probably exacerbated so many of these things, but how would you address that?
Yeah, I don't know how much urban policy per se flows into that problem. There seems to be a lot of consensus that some of these issues are related to, mobile phones and social media. The pandemic obviously played a role. It is the case that the city is sort of a place that's often been celebrated as a place where you move to escape the strictures of where you grew up, where there's great freedoms, where you're more anonymous and you can kind of explore who you are. But I think that the downsides of that are we see that cities are often very isolating and very lonely for many people who don't have family there, who didn't maybe grow up in the big city. And we've certainly seen in the tremendous urban centers of America, like San Francisco and New York, tremendous declines in the number of children. They seem to become dominated by more singles and childless people. And if you have a kid, you end up leaving when the kid turns school age. When I lived on the Upper West Side, my wife and I had a child. People ask, are you guys going to leave? And I said, well, I'm not planning to leave, but I look around the neighborhood and I see that it's full of kids, but they're all 5 and under. So highly likely I'm going to become a statistic. And when you know it, we did end up leaving. So I think to the extent that there's a policy, some sort of policy solution to that, something that enables more diversity of sort of lifestyles and families to be in the city, where you create more social networks and more social institutions. I do think it's a challenge to find a way to be able to make family life viable in cities to a much greater extent. But I do think at its core, many of these issues are sort of generational and not specific to cities. Although I do think cities, if you're a person who's prone to loneliness and depression, it could be very easy to become socially disconnected and isolated, I think, in an urban environment, more so than if you're living in your, say, hometown where you're around your family and friends.
I'll just say that I agree with what Aaron had said. I think that housing abundance is something that would have a really meaningful effect, and it's something that's worth pursuing. I'll also say that some of the patterns appear to be somewhat different in the US versus Canada because of the so-called rugrat race dynamic. When you're looking at college-educated parents in the US, they drastically increase the number of hours they spend on kind of child-rearing activities, whereas in Canada, you haven't had quite as pronounced an increase, and I imagine that that has some benefits in terms of how neurotic children are. But one other thing I'll add that's more speculative is about work opportunities. Would it be possible to introduce more meaningful work opportunities for students at the level of secondary school, encourage the idea of gap years, encourage the idea that, this is something that can frankly kind of take you out of your phone and kind of introduce you to the idea of accountability and doing and responsibility. I suspect that that's something that would have significant benefits. However, it's something that you've seen diminish in the face of rising affluence. So that's certainly something that I'd give some thought to.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jonah. I'd like to ask Gordon Lee and Jonathan Bradley from Conservative Values Tomorrow to come and pose their questions to our smart panelists.
Yeah, so my question is about framing our arguments. So in the area of drug policy, I find that the left's very creative or very clever at coming up with smart euphemisms to describe their policies. So for example, they use the word safe a lot. Safe injection sites, safe supply, even though there's no safe way to ingest what are obviously fatal toxins to the body. But I find that this works. When I'm talking to friends, especially those who don't know much about drug policy, I find that there's almost a default instinct to support the left's policies because they're like, how can I be opposed to anything that's safe? Mm-hmm. So for conservatives, how can we frame our arguments in an area like drug policy, for example, to counteract the left's euphemisms? Do we create our own euphemisms? What is our answer to something like safe supply or safe injection sites?
There's a very smart man in this room who once taught me words are weapons. And I think that that's such a critical part when you are trying to sell a message, regardless of what side of the political aisle you're on. But Gordon brings up an important point. The messaging around things like safe injection sites. How could you possibly oppose that? If you oppose that, you don't want people to be safe. Is there a messaging problem or a challenge that conservatives could tackle, or any suggestions in that regard?
Well, I think for better or for worse, I think it's very astute to observe that you do need kind of clear, simple frames that can resonate. I think for better or for worse, conservatives, particularly in urban areas, are oftentimes playing defense. I see this often when it comes to the discourse of racial justice as it relates to public safety. The big proponents of depolicing and decarceration are constantly making the case that these are ways to advance the cause of racial justice, the criminal justice system is racist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that one approach is to basically speak the truth, which is that when you're looking at victimization, you also see really dramatically disparate patterns. That is to say, in U.S. cities where folks who belong to visible minorities are disproportionately likely to get arrested or incarcerated, well, guess what? Who is disproportionately likely to be brutalized by violent crime? Who is disproportionately likely to get murdered? Who is disproportionately likely to be the victims of various permissive policies? And it's oftentimes folks from those visible minorities, from disadvantaged minorities. And I think that, again, one could argue that, hey, actually, we shouldn't be fixating on victimhood. We shouldn't be kind of divvying up the whole population into these different categories. I think that that's a legitimate perspective. But once that idea has, for better or for worse, I would say worse, so permeated the discourse, you sometimes need to basically use those tools against the folks who are advancing these deeply destructive ideas.
Aaron, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any answers on the drug policy per se, but I do think it goes back to what you said earlier about, the big spender comes in and then the person comes in to cut. I do think for a certain class of conservative thinker, being the person who gets to be the stern dad who has to come in and say no and makes you, clean up your room and cut the budgets and make the tough choices, that persona seems to resonate. And people don't want to be told to eat their spinach all the time. And so there is a place for making tough calls, but also you have to come up with things that you're for. I mean, it's easy to say, I oppose, safe injection sites. Well, what do you propose? And I think that has been the real issue with conservatives, is they know very much what they're for, what they're against, but not what they're for. And that's why I say the positive governing agenda. And although it's not a municipal issue, this is the question I always ask. What is the Republican health care plan in the United States? Realistically, they don't have one. That's why they couldn't repeal Obamacare, because they don't have anything to replace it with. And so it's very easy to run against things, and that has been what conservatives have done too much. It's like, I'm not for anything, but I'm opposed to what the other people do. So we have to have, I think, a positive, that's what I call it the positive governing agenda. And it could be something that's, could be tough. But I think you also have to have something to offer people besides, I'm going to be the guy who says no.
We have one last question from Jonathan Bradley.
Canadian Conservatives do well at the provincial and federal levels, but struggle to be elected at municipal governments because of framing of issues such as safe supply. What can Conservatives do to be more electable at the municipal level?
Well, I think you've kind of touched on it, Aaron, for example, just about that positive. We all know what we're opposed to, but what are the positive solutions that we're going to do to fix it for the broader population?
Yeah, I'd say there's some of that. Again, positive governing agenda and competence. The other thing, the U.S. kind of leftist techno-wonk Matthew Iglesias likes to talk about what he calls popularism. And so he's big, look, if we want to advance kind of, liberal goals, we shouldn't talk about these things activists love that are not very popular. We should be talking about things that are very popular. And so I would suggest conservatives need to really look at when trying to develop that positive governing agenda, adopt what I call conservative popularism. And I think that that's something that Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida has done at the state level. If you looked at the things where he has gone in and said no, he's tended to pick things that are not very popular. Mm-hmm. And so, early childhood sexual education, highly sexually explicit things in kindergarten schools, it's not popular. People don't like it. Some of this sort of woke discourse, it's actually not very popular. On the other hand, Florida, he has not pushed extremely strong abortion laws in Florida. I think Florida banned abortion at 15 weeks, actually more permissive than in Europe. And he's like, look, this is not necessarily as going to play as well. So I think looking for areas where, the ideologies are way out of step with public opinion, that's where you have opportunities to eject. And the other one is where, kind of call it the conservative playbook, has a real applicability to problems. So in housing, clearly more free market solutions to housing, deregulation of housing supply is desperately needed. I think also when you look at public transit, it's been well established by folks like the Marin Institute at New York University that Anglosphere transit costs are way too high. Certainly the United States is the worst. Canada spends too much money building transit projects. This is one where just bringing cost in line with global norms actually is a huge win for the public. And so those are the two things I would suggest is look for and maybe safe injection sites are actually not popular. Who knows? I don't have the polling on that, but I would look for I would look for conservative popularism and then areas where the kind of the conservative playbook is obviously applicable to the problems.
Raihan?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that one way to think about this political challenge is that everyone has multiple identities. We have many different ways of understanding ourselves. And political messages, to some degree, the art of political messaging is about activating some identities as opposed to other identities, raising the salience of some identities. Now, one big issue that we work on at the Manhattan Institute is, basically the pervasiveness, the excesses of identity politics. And one way to look at that is that, you have a group of folks on the left in the US who basically are trying to raise the salience of race and racial identity. And the vision was this idea, we're going to create a coalition of all people of color, quote unquote. This group doesn't actually exist, but you're taking a kind of congeries, complex collection of different groups with different backgrounds and what have you, and you kind of unite them under this kind of single umbrella. Now, I think that if you want to oppose that kind of frame, what you want to do is activate people's other identities. Maybe in the case of Ford Nation, it was their identity as drivers, right? Who kind of wanted to live in single-family homes, wanted to have a certain kind of quality of life. Now, that was something that could create a different kind of polarization. Or you look, as Aaron was suggesting, at a different set of 70-30 issues, the kind of popular frame, where certainly in the U.S. conversation, people who embrace ideas that make sense to big foundations, elite universities, and what have you, conversations that are useful for you in that domain, can become incredibly toxic in a wider public conversation. Defund the police is a great way to make yourself seem incredibly interesting and transgressive, or at least it was a few years ago, if you're at Yale Law School or something like that. But if you're actually talking to, Chinese Americans in San Francisco who are deeply concerned about what's happening to kind of elderly folks in their communities, that idea is incredibly toxic, and it activates a different identity for you. It activates not the identity that I'm an outsider, I am a victim, I'm part of the minority. It activates the identity that I am a guardian, I am a protector, I'm part of this community, and I want to protect the elders in my community. And these guys are actually speaking to that, they're activating that. I think that that's very powerful. So I would encourage people to think of people as multidimensional, and never give up, never surrender the idea that there are certain communities that are unreachable to you.
Thank you for the questions.
So we have just a few short minutes left before we wrap up. I want to touch on some of the other issues that are happening now, and it's not just in Canadian municipalities, it's happening in your country, in the U.S. as well. Aaron touched on it, just mentioned it, and that, of course, is the housing crisis. The fact that living in an urban center has become unattainable for so many. High interest rates keep them out of the housing market from ownership. They're staying at home longer, they're renting longer, they're not getting into that space where they can start creating their own wealth through home ownership. Market solutions, we know, are part of the solution to that. Is there anything in and around that you have, with the work that you do, you've studied, you've observed, that moving forward, other than cutting red tape and opening up perhaps more land to develop, what are you seeing out there as part of that solution? Aaron, I'll start with you.
Well, I'm much more familiar with the American context, but the price, there's two sides to the price. There's supply and demand, and I think there's been a lot of focus on the supply issue, which definitely is an issue and needs to be addressed. There's also the demand issue, and so when you look at, for example, you look at the UK, they build hardly any housing, and yet they're hundreds of thousands of immigrants are coming there every year. So when you have static supply in your housing and you're saying, well, we want to have like a very open immigration policy, those two things don't go together. So you're actually pressing down on the gas in some cases on the demand side. In the United States, we've also seen, the rise of large investment funds buying up huge numbers of houses. That's additional demand in the market. We've also seen, again, foreign buyers coming in and buying real estate. I think that's been a big controversy in Vancouver, that people who don't live there are buying up real estate. And so, although it doesn't necessarily seem per se a conservative solution in some cases, if you cannot moderate the supply side, is there something you could do on the demand side, particularly around things like, we're going to restrict foreign, non-owner occupied, foreign real estate purchases in our city. until we have some issues. So I think there is something you could look at on the demand side, but that's really, it really, in some extent, is that simple. There's supply and demand, and you can really only push one of the other levers.
This is a really profound issue. It is something that is causing major political ructions in market democracies around the world. If you look at Ireland right now, Ireland is a place that had very large immigrant inflows for a very long time. It was not controversial until suddenly it became controversial. It was a cascade. It was something that the kind of political establishment did not predict, and it's something that has now become an incredibly rancorous debate that could really shake the kaleidoscope there politically. And I think that if you're someone who believes that immigration can enrich the country, contribute to its economic and cultural vitality, you really need to get the housing piece of it right. And I think that a big challenge is that you basically have a group of people who are homeowners, who are property owners, who are broadly satisfied with the status quo, who benefit from the status quo. This asset that's an incredibly important part of their portfolio is growing in value. That's not necessarily such a bad thing. In the US, one big problem is that this kind of so-called YIMBY movement is typically operating in monolithically left-of-center places. And so the arguments that they advance are arguments designed to appeal to people on the left. They're arguments about racial justice, unfairness, you are a bad person for not kind of welcoming people into your neighborhood. You're a bad person if you're concerned about disorder and crime and what have you that kind of might stem from, congestion, things that might stem from changing land use. I would argue, as someone who is pretty YIMBY friendly, that you need to frame arguments that are win-win arguments. You need to frame arguments that are about, whether or not this community is going to be viable for your children and grandchildren. Ways that you can unlock the value of your home that are not necessarily built on exclusion. And I think that another big thing is local fiscal incentives. So a big thing that you see in many so-called exclusionary communities is that you're basically saying, okay, well, if we actually admit a lot of folks who are lower income, that's going to represent more strain on our services without making a commensurate increase in our tax base. And that's just a lose-lose proposition, right, for the folks who are incumbents in those communities. It would be far more constructive to think about how do you change those local fiscal incentives than say that you were a bad person for having a problem with the fact that your fiscal position is going to get markedly worse in this scenario. So again, that's something that's going to vary from place to place, but I think that this is a really, really big, important issue for this reason. There are a lot of populists, on both sides of the border who are thinking a lot about the fate of the working class. They're thinking about economic upward mobility. How do we help people build wealth? Also, how do you think about marriage and the family? How do you keep families intact? And one thing that I found incredibly profound is that when you're looking at the availability of home ownership as an option, that actually has a material effect. So why is it that among upper middle income folks, marriage rates are pretty similar to what they were 20, 30, 40 years ago, whereas among working class people, they've collapsed? One hypothesis is that when you're in a marriage, when you have collateral, it matters. Because let's say the marriage dissolves, let's say you get divorced. Are you actually able to get something out of that if you're the lower earning spouse? So just put this in. If you're a woman who's entering into a relationship, you know that, hey, at least I'll get the house in a divorce. That could encourage you to specialize. That could encourage you to think that I'm not always going to be looking for the exits. It's actually something that is shaping the lives and the cultural sensibilities of people in a very big way. When housing is not available to you, what's the difference between being married and not married in terms of your protection? So I know that sounds very kind of bloodless and abstract, but actually those economic factors really affect people at that kind of most basic level when they're making decisions about when to take a risk, when to enter into a certain relationship that, again, might wind up dissolving. So I think getting this right is hugely important because actually the lack of affordable housing is something that is moving huge numbers of young people in market democracies throughout the world to the far left. It is actually the big thing that makes the idea of democratic socialism seem attractive to people who would otherwise be successful professionals who are building wealth and trying to build families. It's incredibly noxious, and it's something that conservatives in particular really need to address.
Well, we don't have any more time to address all these other big issues, including the fact that the city of Toronto is having a big election coming up in a few weeks. And as much as me being from Western Canada, I hate admitting it, but it is a very consequential election. It's the largest city in the country, biggest operating budget than some of the provinces combined. So many of these things that we've talked about today are at the top of the ballot. The number one issue being housing, the housing crisis. But I very much want to thank you for your thoughtful assessments of the state of affairs, Aaron and Raihan, and thank you to the audience, and thank you for the questions.